Morjentes ja tervetuloa Tyrnävä Showhun. Jakson aiheena on Freeman, Valheita, joita kerromme Kiinasta. Hän oli professori Glenn Diesenin vieraana tässä hiljattain. Mutta ennen kuin mennään aiheeseen, niin otetaan tämmöinen lyhyt tietopläjäys. Morjentes! Tyrnävä Shown tietopläjäys. 3 pointtia. Miten ravinteet vaikuttavat terveyteen antaen virtaa ja pidentäen jopa elinikää? Elämme nopeasti päivittyvässä maailmassa, työelämä muuttuu ja uusia ansaintavaihtoehtoja elannon hankkimiseen aukeaa. Eli tarvitsetko elämääsi uusia ansaintamahdollisuuksia? Tuntuvatko omat piirit jo nähdyiltä ja loppuun käydyltä? Haluatko uusia yrittäjävetoisia ihmisiä ja kansainvälisiä verkostoja elämääsi? Vastatessasi kyllä vähintään yhteen kohtaan, laita mailia, niin kerron lisää. tyrnäväshow@gmail.com. Yhteydenottoihin Tyrnävä Show kiittää. Noin. Ja nyt sitten kiinnostavan aiheeseen. Ja tosiaan Lähteenä tälle on Glenn Diesenin YouTube-kanava. Ja siinä. Ja tämä on automaattikääntämisellä tehty, eli siinä on suomenkieliset tekstit. Ja tämä on nyt 20 minuutin pätkä tuosta tunnin ohjelmasta. Alkuun. Mä linkkaan sitten tuohon esittelytekstiin niin suoran linkin tuohon Diesenin ohjelmaan, jos haluatte katsoa tuon koko tunnin. Suosittelen. Nimittäin me aika vähän tunnetaan Kiinaa. Mukaan lukien minäkään en tunne paljon Kiinaa. Niin tästä tulee kyllä tosi tärkeää asiaa, jos aihe kiinnostaa. Niin laitanpa pyörimään.
I thought it's good to start maybe with a bit of an open or wide question, which is that you've complained that there are in the United States there's often a lack of knowledge about China, which is why we often lean into stereotypes. What do you see as being the main misperceptions about China today? What is it that the political establishment in the United States don't understand about China?
Where to begin? The number of delusions, misperceptions is quite large. And unfortunately, of course, Americans these days are quite insular. I remember being told at the end of by Arnaud de Bosgraaf, who was a well-known journalist, war correspondent in World War II, that in 1947 there were, I think, 2,700 U.S. foreign correspondents for a newspaper scene that was very fragmented. Almost every newspaper had its own foreign correspondent. And Americans were really quite well informed about the world. Today, there are less than 100 foreign correspondents for the United States, which is why when you hear the news, if it's about something abroad, you're probably hearing a BBC stringer or someone. So we're not very well informed generally. Our schools no longer teach geography. People joke that Americans learn geography by going to war with wherever it is. And but mainly we have gone through a series of phases. We had an entente with China, never an alliance, a limited cooperation for limited purposes. Driven entirely by geopolitical considerations. The Chinese were already split from the Soviets, and they were under pressure from Moscow. There was a real danger of a preemptive Soviet invasion of China in the 1960s. At the end of the 60s, there was actual fighting. and President Nixon had the wit to see that we could enlist China in support of the containment of the USSR, which is what we did. That was an entente. Perhaps maybe China was a sort of protected state in the sense that it had been in World War II when we supported the Chinese government against Japan, mainly not because we had any expectation that China could defeat Japan, but we had the hope that it would tie down a vast number of Japanese forces who might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. So it was a strategic move. The continued independence of China was strategically important to us. And the same was true in the Cold War. But when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union imploded after the Berlin Wall came down, we no longer had a common enemy. And simultaneously, this is all, I think the crucial year was 1989. The Berlin Wall came down, of course, in November. In June, there was the student and worker revolt in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, which was put down with force. That drained all the warmth from the US-China relationship. And finally, that year was also the year that Taiwan ceased to be a Leninist dictatorship and became a democracy. So we had suddenly three forces directing us toward antipathy to China. The geopolitical argument for cooperation had apparently disappeared. The ideological equation of Taipei with Beijing had disappeared because Taipei was no longer Leninist while Beijing remained so. And of course, there were the lingering effects of anti-communism, containment, the experiences of the Korean and Vietnam War. All these things are still with us. So I believe that we are hamstrung in for foreign relations by the absence of a detailed vocabulary for describing relationships. And I've gone around some of them. Alliances are unconditional commitments to mutual assistance. Ententes are conditional contingent relationships, which envisage some kind of limited cooperation, or perhaps for a limited time. Client states basically derive protection from affording the other country, the larger one, privileges, prerogatives, and a lot of international relations are simply give and take on an equal basis, very transactional. But when you get to the varieties of competition or confrontation, I think there are four. First is rivalry, which you mentioned. I'd be very cautious about that word because I think it basically means a healthy competition. That is one in which you try to outdo the other by improving yourself. It's like going to a track meet. If you run on the track, and you beat the other side, the other people, it's because you've trained better, you're physically stronger, you're faster, not because they are weaker or whatever, or because you sabotage them. Because after rivalry, we have what I call adversarial antagonism. Now, that is where you seek to win by tripping or hamstringing the other party on the track, not by excelling yourself, but by injuring the other side so that it can't match you. And then finally, if you carry that far enough, you enter the realm of enmity, where your objective is the annihilation of the other side. We saw that in the Cold War, constrained by a fear of nuclear exchanges. So where we are with China is we've gone through the whole circle from protected state status in World War II and again in the Cold War, entente, cooperation in Afghanistan against the Soviet occupation, transactional relationship, rivalry, very healthy competition. And now we're at adversarial antagonism. And our objective is to hold China down, if possible, push it back. And that is, of course, impossible because we have limited capacity to do that, and China is going ahead on its own. So I'm sorry about the long-winded response, but this is a very strategically very complex relationship. We've just seen the United States and China engage in serious economic warfare and then achieve apparently some sort of relaxation of tensions, limited, a détente, if you will. But it's not a truce. We haven't given up the antagonism. It's not a ceasefire. We're not going to stop taking steps against each other. All it is a reduction in the intensity of the confrontation, while we see if we can reach some kind of longer-term understanding that ends the trade war, or at least confines it within limits, a sort of arms control agreement, if you will. But we're not, the Trump administration portrays this as a major victory for its maximum pressure tactics. It's not. The Chinese didn't want tariffs. They retaliated. The United States is now backed down.
Well, I appreciate you differentiating between rivalry and antagonism, because it does. Well, I'm quite supportive and hopeful about American industrial policies to strengthen its technological sovereignty and competitiveness. But there is something else, though, which is this. If that was enough, I think the U.S. could have take its time to do gradual build-up and reindustrialize all of the things which I think should be done. But it appears that a lot of these policies go into overdrive because the objective isn't simply to become more competitive, but also, as you said, to break China as well. So that's beyond the competition. It seems to, but the idea, this need to break China, is this does this go to the ideology or the view of the world then? Because if there was a willingness to essentially share the stage with China as an equal, the US could have a more moderate industrial policy in terms of just rebuilding its own strength, not necessarily, again, breaking the knees of the Chinese. Is this does this go to ideology? How do you explain the I guess the demand for primacy in this relationship?
Well, I think the driver of all this is psychological distress at losing primacy. That is, around 1870, the United States became the largest economy in the world, and in the 20th century, we became, by stages, the dominant political and military force in the world, as well as the dominant financial power and for a long time, economic power. Now we see China, if you measure the GDP of the two countries by the proper standard for comparison, which is purchasing power parity, not nominal exchange rates, which fluctuate and which represent extraneous factors, then China's economy is already 1/3 larger than ours. It produces over 1/3 of the world's manufactured goods. We produce about 15% now. It is very embedded in the Bretton Woods post-World War II institutions, for example, the World Trade Organization, which we have walked away from. So we have the ironic situation that the Chinese are defending the world order that we created while trying to tweak it a bit into their advantage, of course. And we are acting destructively. In this context, we don't pay any attention to the UN Charter, international law. We've sabotaged the World Trade Organization. We've walked out of various specialized UN bodies when we don't like what the global majority decides. And we are becoming more isolated. China is becoming more engaged. So this is what is happening. As to restoring competitiveness, which I think is an entirely appropriate goal, I think we have to, recognize some economic realities. First of all, what's happened in industry is exactly what happened in agriculture. So in 1900, I don't know the situation in Norway, but in 1900 in the United States, roughly 80% of the population worked on the farm to produce food. Now it's less than 1%, and we produce more food than ever. That is because capital has substituted for labor. That is, people have become more productive because they've mechanized agriculture. They've also introduced science and bred better varieties of plants that are more resistant to disease and so forth, give higher yields. And the same is true with the animal population. So what is happening in industry is exactly the same thing. I said 1900, 80% worked in agriculture, 15% or so were in industry, 5% were in what was called services, a very vague category. But if you look at the situation now, you'll find less than 1% in agriculture, 8% in industry. That is half of the percentage of 125 years ago. And there too, automation, robotics, various techniques for managing production, beginning with the assembly line, Henry Ford's invention, and continuing through multiple stages, have made the American worker vastly more productive. So far fewer people are needed to produce much more goods. We actually produce more than ever, but our employment in industry is going down. And finally, we have, so that's 91, let's see, 15, that is 8%, 1%. That is 91% are in something called services, which has essentially become a meaningless category and needs to be re-examined by economists. They invented that category in the 1930s along with GDP, badly needs a theoretical re-examination. So we're seeing the same things happening in China. Agricultural workforce is declining rapidly. The industrial workforce industrial jobs are going down. We see unemployment now in China among youth who were educated for an industrial economy that now no longer requires them. So what is the relevance of all this? Well, things are happening in the United States which produce a great deal of angst, disquiet. And rather than looking at the causes of these, which are intrinsic to progress, we blame foreigners. So who is the perfect foreigner to blame? China. Why? Because we have a history of anti-Chinese sentiment. We have a history of a containment of China in the Cold War. It's run by something that calls itself the Communist Party. We imagine that if you've seen one communist, you've seen them all. The people who make these statements about China and communism and so forth have neither met a Chinese or never been to China, nor have they ever met a communist of any kind, except the Vietnamese, who are anti-Chinese and therefore good people, despite their misguided ideology. So there are many factors going into this, but the bottom line is we have a very distorted view of China, inadequate press coverage, biased editorial policies in our media, a political establishment that has made China the enemy of choice. So we are in a very strange position. You can't have an effective policy negotiating position or competition if you misunderstand with whom you are competing. And we fairly fundamentally do. On top of this, you mentioned industrial policy. The Chinese have come up with a very effective pattern of industrial policy, which basically relies on policy banks that lend to support national objectives. So you get strange things when you do this to some extent. For example, a Chinese company acquired most of Pirelli, the Italian tire maker, under the Belt and Road Initiative because it was able to portray that as somehow related to the Belt and Road. I find that rather far-fetched, but apparently one of the policy banks was prepared to support it with lending. So you have essentially Deng Xiaoping's idea that if you want to get across the river, you have an objective. You just tell people, you get across the river, I don't care how you do it. If you get there, it'll be worth your while financially. So he came up with the idea of feeling your way across the river with your toes on the rocks. That's what the Chinese do. They announce an objective. Let's say we need an electric economy. We need renewable energy. And they say, and if you invest in these things, we'll back you financially. So the result is, over 50% of the hydroelectric power under construction is in China. 70% of the solar power under construction is in China. Similar pattern for wind power. And of course, China leads in electric vehicles. It also leads in high voltage transmission systems. It leads in the efficiency of electric power production and so forth. I could take other examples because China is now ahead in the vast majority of technologies, something which we don't understand. We imagine export controls can preserve our precious bodily fluids from being drained by the Chinese from us. If you remember Dr. Strangelove, he's alive and well in Washington somewhere, and even if Kissinger is dead.
Well, I was going to say that.
Noin, siinä tuli kiinnostavaa asiaa. Ja tosiaan, tuossa on sitten linkki tässä jakson esittelyssä, niin päästä katsoa siitä tämän koko tunnin haastattelun. Suosittelen, tämä on erittäin kiinnostavaa asiaa ja maailma muuttuu. Mä muistan 2000-luvun puolessa välissä, kun törmää Helsingissä kiinalaisiin insinööriopiskelijoihin, jotka on tullut opiskelemaan, miten kännyköitä tehdään. Ja silloin mäkin muistan, että vähän niin kuin nauraskin, että hei, kiinalaisia kännyköitä. Ja sitten mitä se oli 2012, kun Noxon kännykkä nurin ja sitten vaan China-luuria ja Apple-luuria, niin maailma muuttuu. Sitä kun jämähtää paikoilleen, niin muu maailma menee ohi. Ja Suomi on todellakin jämähtänyt paikoilleen. Tai ehkä jämähtänyt paikoilleenkin on niin kuin liian lievä ilmaus, vaan olemme omaksuneet erittäin vahingolliset ideologiat ja ajattelutavat. Ja siinä sitä meidän ajattelutavan hedelmää nyt on 173 miljardia. Sitten se on jo 800 miljoonaa on tuo miljoonien määrä. Eli menisikö se jo tuossa viikonloppuna tai maanantaina sitten viimeistään, niin 174 miljardia rikki. Tämä on kova on tahti. 200 miljardia menee tämän hallituskauden aikana rikkiin, jos pitävät tätä tahtia yllä. Ja miksi eivät pitäisi, koska näin EU-liittovaltio etenee. Mutta tämmöinen, kannattaa muistaa Glenn Diesenin kanava. Sieltä löytyy aina välillä niin kuin todella hyviä vieraita. Toikin oli ihan huikea, hieno toi Kiina-jakso. No niin, ei muuta kuin terveisiä tätä Tyrnävä Shown Datsalta. Morjentas.